Joseph Stalin signed death warrants the way other people answer emails. Calmly, methodically, sometimes late at night after movies and a long dinner. And yet the same man loved roses, sang beautifully, wrote poetry as a young man. His daughter remembered moments of genuine tenderness. His closest subordinates, the ones who survived, remembered real laughter. That contradiction is what makes him so difficult to understand and so difficult to look away from. Good evening and welcome back to the Sleepy Biographer. Tonight we're doing something a little different. Not a chronicle of battles or empires. Not a march through dates and political milestones. Tonight we are going inside the mind of one of the most consequential, most studied, most deeply strange figures in modern history. We're asking a different set of questions than the ones historians usually ask. Not what did he do? That record exists, and it is staggering in its weight. But who was he, really? What did he fear? What did he want? What did he see when he looked at the people around him? What broke in him, and when and whether anything had ever been whole to begin with? Before we begin, if these calm documentary explorations help you end the day with something meaningful, something that asks real questions rather than offering easy answers, then please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. It helps other quiet listeners find their way here. Now, let's go back to a small town in Georgia in the year 1878 and meet a boy named So-So. The town of Gori sits in central Georgia, a country that has spent most of its history caught between empires. To the north, Russia. To the south and east, Persia and the Ottoman world. The mountains rise behind it. The Mtkvari River runs nearby. In the late 19th century, it was a provincial backwater, not quite civilized by Russian imperial standards, not quite wild either. A town of craftsmen, merchants, churches, and feuds. Georgia has a particular culture of honor, and historians of Stalin consistently return to this fact, not to excuse anything, but to understand it. In the Caucasus, vendettas were not aberrations, they were traditions. The memory of an insult could survive generations. The repayment of a wrong was not merely personal, it was a moral obligation. The language of honor and humiliation ran deep in Georgian society. And a boy who grew up feeling humiliated, which this boy absolutely did, would have absorbed those values in his bones before he ever read a word of Marx or Lenin. Joseph Yugashvili was born on December 18, 1878. He was the only child of Bessarion and Ekaterine Yugashvili to survive infancy. 2 older siblings died before he was born. That fact alone shapes something in the dynamic of a household. The mother who had already lost 2 children would not be a mother who took her surviving child's safety lightly. His father, Bessarion, called Beso by everyone who knew him, was a cobbler. A skilled one, actually, at least in his earlier years. But the cobbler's trade was being mechanized across the Russian Empire. Cheaper shoes were being made in factories elsewhere. Men like Beso found their work drying up. And Beso, faced with that decline, responded by drinking. The drinking made him violent. The violence fell on the people nearest to him. Neighbors in Gori long remembered the beatings, not because they were especially unusual in that time and place, but because of their particular savagery. On one occasion, Beso threw a hammer at the boy, who would have been barely old enough to walk steadily. The hammer missed, just barely. One slightly different angle, and the man we call Stalin never exists. History pivots on moments like that, and never tells us about them. What does a small child learn from that kind of father? Several things, all of them lasting. He learns that power is physical, that it is held by the person willing to inflict the most pain. He learns that the world is not safe, that the people who are supposed to protect you are sometimes the most dangerous people in the room. He learns to read moods with extraordinary precision because survival depends on it. You have to know when the danger is building, when to make yourself small, when to get out of the way. Stalin's capacity to read people, to sense what they were thinking, what they feared, what they wanted, was one of the qualities that every person who knew him remarked on. Subordinates were unnerved by it. Rivals were undone by it. He seemed to see through people in a way that was almost uncanny. And it's entirely possible that this gift was not a gift at all. It was a survival mechanism learned before his 5th birthday. Beso eventually lost the workshop, lost his money, and lost whatever remained of his restraint. Ekaterine, everyone called her Keke, eventually took Soso and left. They moved through 9 different rented rooms over the following years, a kind of domestic nomadism born of poverty and necessity. At one point, Beso dragged the boy away to work in a shoe factory in Tiflis, apparently deciding that formal education was a waste. Keke fought to get him back. She won. That episode reveals something about both parents. Beso saw the boy as labor, as something useful, as a resource to be claimed. Keke saw him as a future. Specifically, she saw him as her future, as the vessel through which she, a woman of modest origins with no path of her own, could achieve something she could not achieve herself. She was not always a warm mother. She beat him too, though apparently with different energy than his father. But she was utterly devoted to the project of his advancement. She wanted him educated. She wanted him to be a priest. The relationship between Stalin and his mother is more tangled than it first appears. He called her his mother dear in letters throughout his life. His daughter Svetlana described him as genuinely softer around Keke than he was around almost anyone else. When Keke died in 1937, the year the Great Purge was reaching its most horrifying peak, when thousands were being shot every night on Stalin's orders, he was reported to have wept. Whether that grief was real, performed, or something complicated in between, no one alive can say. But Keke never really knew her son. She lived into the 1930s and died having seen him become the ruler of the largest country on earth, and she reportedly remained puzzled about why he hadn't become a priest. That small fact says something quietly devastating about the gap between parent and child, between the modest ambitions of a Georgian cobbler's widow and the monstrous reality her son had built. Before Stalin became a political machine, he was a boy trapped inside a body he hated. And that hatred never left him. It just learned to wear different clothes. We need to talk about his body, because the body shapes the psychology. And Stalin's body was, by any account, a catalogue of damage. When he was 7 years old, he contracted smallpox. It was a severe case. He survived, which was not guaranteed in 1885 in rural Georgia. But the virus left its mark, deeply pitted scars across his face that would follow him for the rest of his life. Photographs from his adult years show it clearly if you look closely, though the official portraits were carefully retouched to minimize the scarring. Later, Soviet photographers were instructed to use specific lighting and specific angles. The ideal Stalin had smooth skin. When he was 12, he was struck by a horse-drawn carriage, and the injuries to his left arm were severe enough to leave him with a permanent disability. The arm was shorter than the right, the elbow damaged, the joint stiff. Throughout his life, he held his left arm differently, walked with it slightly bent, and was extraordinarily sensitive about anyone noticing. In official portraits, the arm was hidden, cropped, or otherwise minimized. He was also short, 5 feet 4 inches by most estimates. In a culture, and eventually a role, that associated physical size with dominance, this mattered to him. He wore built-up boots. He stood on slightly elevated platforms when being photographed with other leaders. None of this was trivial to him. Not the scars, not the arm, not the height. Picture the official portraits, the ones hung in every school and factory across the Soviet Union. The skin smooth, the arm positioned just so, the gaze level and authoritative. Each one a careful correction. The gap between those portraits and the actual man in the room was not vanity. It was architecture. You build compensatory structures around injuries like that. You develop other kinds of authority. You learn to make a room afraid of you by means other than physical size. To survive what he was, he needed to become someone else. And at roughly 10 years old, he found the someone. And this is where things get genuinely strange. At the Gori church school, the young Soso Jugashvili read a novel. It was called The Patricide, written by Alexander Kazbegi, a Georgian author writing in the nationalist tradition. The hero of the book was a man named Coba, a fierce, uncompromising defender of his people against oppression. A man who avenged wrongs, who faced down power, who embodied a vision of Georgian masculine honor. Soso read the book and didn't just enjoy it. He became it. He began demanding that his friends and schoolmates call him Coba, not Soso, not Josep, Coba. He maintained this demand with enough force that it stuck. Years later, into his adult revolutionary career, many of his oldest comrades still called him Coba. The name wouldn't fully give way to Stalin until the revolution itself. A child who has been beaten by a drunk father, who carries the scars of disease on his face, who lives in 9 rented rooms with an overprotective mother. That child reads a novel about a powerful avenger and says, "That is who I am." Not, "That is who I want to be." That is who I am. He didn't aspire to Coba. He became Coba. The fictional character gave him a usable identity, a template for the self he needed to construct in order to survive and eventually to dominate. Because what Stalin spent his entire life doing, at some level, was performing a character he had invented in a schoolyard in Gori when he was roughly 10 years old. Later in life, Stalin would go by many names and aliases during his years underground. He chose Stalin, from the Russian word stal, meaning steel, sometime around 1912. Steel, the hardest, the most unbending, the most resistant to damage. A man named Jugashvili, beaten by his father, scarred by disease, broken in his arm, short and provincial and hungry, who called himself Steel and demanded the world agree. Picture the long stone corridors of an Orthodox seminary in Tiflis. Cold morning light. Bells. Students whose mail is being read before they receive it. A boy who has already stopped believing in God, learning, very carefully, how institutions break people down. Keki's ambition for her son was a priest. She managed to get him a scholarship to the Gori church school, where he excelled academically and sang in the choir. He had a genuinely beautiful tenor voice, one of those surprising small facts about him that biographers mention with a certain dissonance. And in 1894, at the age of 15, he enrolled at the Tiflis Theological Seminary. The seminary was an institution of surveillance. This is not metaphor. Students' mail was read, their movements tracked, their conversations noted. informers active among the student body. The methods were designed to produce obedience, to break down individualism, to create conformity through the constant awareness that someone might always be watching. Simon Sebag Montefiore notes that the seminary's methods repelled the young student, but also impressed him acutely. He hated being watched, but he could see that it worked. He spent the rest of his life refining those methods. The seminary also gave him something else: a framework of sin, guilt, and retribution. The theological categories, transgression, confession, punishment, redemption, permeated the environment. Stalin became an atheist, probably within his first year. He read Darwin, read the materialist philosophers, rejected the faith his mother had sent him to cultivate. But he never shed the theological structure. His political thinking was saturated with quasi-religious language. Enemies of the state were apostates. Confessions were not merely legal instruments, but ritualistic performances of submission and self-denunciation. The show trials of the 1930s had a liturgical quality to them. He had been a student in that school. He simply became the priest. An atheist who thought like a seminarian, a Georgian who ruled like a czar, a Marxist who governed like a feudal lord. The contradictions are real, and they're there from the very beginning. He was expelled from the seminary in 1899. The official reason was non-payment of fees, though scholars have debated whether his growing revolutionary sympathies played a role. Either way, he left without a degree. In a movement full of educated men, Lenin, Trotsky, Bukharin, men who had studied in universities across Europe, Stalin was the one who dropped out of priest school. The resentment this produced is not speculative. It surfaces in the historical record in small but consistent ways. He was dismissive of intellectuals. He was suspicious of expertise, prone to overriding specialists in fields, military strategy, agricultural science, biology, where he had no training but felt entitled to hold an authoritative view. This was not simply ignorance. He knew enough to know the limits of what he knew, and he bridged those limits with the particular aggression of a man who had been made to feel inadequate and had never forgiven anyone for it. There is another thing the seminary gave him that belongs in this portrait. It gave him a model for how to make people confess. The theological tradition of confession, the examination of conscience, the acknowledgement of sin, the performing of one's failure before an authority. This was a technology the seminary had deployed on him for 5 years. He had watched it work. He had seen how the practice of naming your transgressions publicly, witnessed by others before a figure of authority, had its own psychological gravity. It was humiliating. It was also, paradoxically, something people often submitted to with something resembling relief, because the uncertainty of concealment was its own torture. The show trials of the 1930s replicated this structure so precisely that it is hard to believe the connection was accidental. The accused confessed in elaborate detail, often to crimes that the available evidence suggests did not occur. They denounced themselves and their associates. They did it publicly, before journalists, before cameras, before a watching world. And then they were shot. The spiritual logic of confession, without the spiritual possibility of absolution. The years between his expulsion from the seminary and the Russian Revolution are years that most popular accounts of Stalin skim through quickly, because they're complicated, and because Stalin's own later accounts of them were heavily falsified. He was not the heroic revolutionary organizer that Soviet hagiography would later describe. He was something more interesting and more useful. He was a criminal. bank robberies, street violence, armed operations to raise money for the Bolshevik cause. The most famous was the Tiflis bank robbery of 1907, a gang of Bolshevik operatives ambushing a convoy of money in the center of the city, killing dozens of bystanders and guards in an explosion of bombs and gunfire. Stalin organized this operation. He didn't participate directly. He stood nearby, watching, as was his preference throughout his life. Let others get their hands dirty while the organizer observes from a safe remove. He was arrested multiple times, exiled to Siberia multiple times, escaped multiple times, or was allowed to escape, which has led some historians to suggest he may have had a complicated relationship with the Tsarist secret police, possibly serving as an informer at certain points. This allegation remains genuinely contested. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. What isn't ambiguous is what those years of underground life did to him psychologically. Constant vigilance, constant suspicion. The revolutionary underground was full of informers, real ones. You never knew who was trustworthy. You learned to wear different faces for different audiences. You learned to reveal nothing that you didn't absolutely have to reveal. You became expert at concealment. He was also becoming something unexpected in those years. A poet. A genuinely accomplished Georgian poet, actually. His early verses were published in Georgian literary journals and were praised by contemporaries. They're romantic, nationalist, lyrical. The man who would order the deaths of millions wrote love poems to Georgia in his 20s. The poems are not aberrations. They're evidence of something that the later history tends to crowd out, which is that there was a whole inner person in there, a person with aesthetic sensibilities and emotional responses. And that person didn't disappear when the power came. He just went underground, which was, after all, where this man had always lived. Vladimir Lenin was the figure Stalin orbited for years before he became his equal, and the relationship was complicated in ways that shaped everything that came after. Lenin recognized Stalin's usefulness early. In the landscape of professional revolutionaries, most of whom were theorists, editors, writers, debaters, men of ideas, Stalin was a man of action. He could get things done in the physical world. Lenin appreciated this. He brought Stalin into the inner circle, and eventually, crucially, arranged for him to be named General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922. Lenin thought it was an administrative post, a clerk's job, essentially. It would turn out to be the most consequential appointment in the 20th century. By 1922, Lenin was already ill, and his assessment of Stalin was changing. He became alarmed by Stalin's treatment of Georgian communists. He was disturbed by an incident in which Stalin telephoned Lenin's wife and shouted abuse at her. Lenin dictated a series of notes known collectively as Lenin's Testament, in which he described Stalin's character: rude, disloyal, capable of abusing power. Lenin's testament explicitly recommended that Stalin be removed from his position as General Secretary. Lenin died in January 1924 before that recommendation could be acted on. Stalin helped organize the funeral. He gave a speech of almost religious devotion. And then, with extraordinary patience and political skill, he suppressed the testament. It was not publicly revealed until 1956, 32 years later. The thing about Stalin's rise to power is that it is so often described as cunning, and it was. But the word doesn't quite capture the specific quality of what he was doing. Cunning suggests something quick, improvisational. Stalin's political maneuvering was the opposite. It was slow, methodical. patient in a way that his rivals consistently misjudged. His rivals, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, were all, in their own ways, impatient men. Men who thought they were more intelligent than Stalin, which in the narrow academic sense most of them were. Men who expected that intelligence would translate into power. Stalin knew something they didn't. Intelligence is not the lever. The lever is personnel. Control who fills the positions, and you control the positions. He had spent years quietly placing loyal people throughout the party apparatus. By the time his rivals understood what he had built, they were already surrounded by it. Trotsky was exiled in 1929, eventually assassinated in Mexico in 1940 by a Soviet agent with an ice axe. Zinoviev and Kamenev were show-trialed and shot in 1936. Bukharin, the man Lenin had called the favorite of the party, was arrested in 1937 and executed in 1938. Almost every figure who had known Stalin as an equal or a subordinate was eventually dead by his direct order. He didn't just want to win the argument. He wanted to eliminate the people who remembered him as someone who could lose one. Before we go further into the darkness of what he built, we need to stop at a moment of something like genuine feeling. Because it happened, and it mattered, and it shaped him. His first wife was named Ekaterina Svanidze, called Kato. She was the sister of a fellow revolutionary, and they married in a Georgian Orthodox ceremony in 1906. Stalin, the declared atheist, agreed to a church wedding out of respect for her. That detail tells you something about the quality of the feeling. They had a son, Yakov, in 1907, and then Kato contracted typhus and died that same year at 22 years old. By all accounts, Stalin was devastated. At her funeral, he is said to have pointed to her coffin and told a friend, "This woman has softened my heart of stone. When she died, she took with her my last warm feelings for humanity." Whether he said exactly those words, we can't know. But the emotional reality underneath is confirmed by every account of how he behaved in the immediate aftermath. He fell apart. He neglected his son Yakov entirely, left the infant with Kato's relatives, and essentially vanished back into the underground. The child would grow up barely knowing his father, and that relationship would haunt both of them for decades. Here is a genuinely difficult question that psychologists and historians have wrestled with. Is it possible that Kato's death hardened something in him that could not be recovered? That the loss of that relationship, the one person who seems to have known the pre-Coba, pre-Stalin, pre-Steele version of him and loved him, was the wound that closed over everything? We can't know, but we can observe the trajectory. The man who wept at Kato's grave became, over the following decades, someone who could read death warrants for hundreds of people in an evening without visible emotion. Something changed. Something contracted. And it is not unreasonable to ask whether this loss was part of what changed it. Nadezhda Alliluyeva was 22 years younger than Stalin. They married in 1919. She was 18. He was 40. She had known him most of her life, and presumably thought she knew who he was. She didn't. Nobody really did. Nadezhda was not a passive woman. She had her own political views, her own opinions about how the Soviet state should be run. She was not afraid to express them to her husband. This was unusual. It was also dangerous. She enrolled in the Industrial Academy in Moscow in 1929, studying chemistry, traveling to class by public transport like an ordinary student. Her classmates didn't know who she was. They told her, casually, in the course of normal student conversation, about the things Stalin's collectivization policies were doing to the countryside. The hunger, the forced deportations, the deaths. She went home and confronted her husband. She called him a butcher of the people. He had her classmates arrested. What Nadezhda had stumbled into was the reality of collectivization, one of the defining catastrophes of Stalin's rule. The famine that followed in 1932 and 1933, particularly severe in Ukraine, where it is known as the Holodomor, killed between 3 and 5 million people, possibly more. The regime knew it was happening, and grain continued to be exported while people starved. Stalin's psychological relationship to this catastrophe is revealing. He did not visit the affected regions. He received the reports through layers of bureaucracy that softened and qualified the numbers. He appears to have convinced himself, or at least to have performed being convinced, that the suffering was the product of Gulag sabotage and Ukrainian nationalist resistance rather than state policy. If people were dying, it was because enemies were causing them to die, which meant the solution was more force against the enemies, not a change in policy. This is a recognizable psychological pattern. It has a clinical name, and it operates at the intersection of genuine paranoia and the protective needs of a narcissistic structure that cannot accommodate error. By November 1932, the marriage had become something airless and poisonous. At a Kremlin banquet on November 8th, a celebration of the revolution's anniversary, Stalin spent the evening drinking, flirting openly with other women, and directing casual cruelty toward his wife. At one point, he flicked orange peels and cigarette stubs at her across the table. When he wanted her to drink a toast, he yelled at her, "Hey you, drink." She replied that her name was not "Hey you," and walked out of the banquet. That night, she shot herself. She was 31 years old. She left a note. Svetlana, who never saw it, described it later as containing both personal reproaches and political accusations. Stalin reportedly read it and went to pieces. At the funeral, he approached the coffin, looked at her, made a dismissive gesture, and walked away. As he left the hall, he was overheard muttering, "She went away as an enemy." She went away as an enemy. His wife, the mother of his children, dead by her own hand, framed in the logic of betrayal. The public was told she had died of appendicitis. Even the children were not told the truth. Svetlana found out years later, accidentally. What Nadezhda's death did to Stalin is genuinely difficult to assess. Whatever it broke or hardened in him, it is buried under layers of performance and control that no researcher has been able to fully penetrate. What the historical record shows is that the period following her death coincided with a steady acceleration of the terror apparatus, a withdrawal from whatever domestic warmth had existed, and an intensification of the suspicion and isolation that would eventually consume everyone around him. He did not remarry. He never took another official partner. He surrounded himself with his security apparatus, his inner circle of terrified loyalists, his late-night film screenings, and his books. 3 children. All of them were damaged by him, and the damage took different forms. Yakov, the son from his first marriage, the child he had abandoned after Kato's death, grew up with his father's relatives and eventually came to Moscow in the 1920s. The relationship was terrible almost from the first moment. Stalin despised what he saw as weakness in the boy. Yakov was gentle, sensitive, not the hard Bolshevik archetype. When Yakov attempted suicide after a failed early marriage, Shooting himself but surviving the wound, Stalin is said to have laughed. He said the boy couldn't even shoot straight. When the Second World War began and Yakov was captured by the Germans offered to exchange him for captured German officers. Stalin refused. He would not trade a marshal for a lieutenant, he reportedly said. Yakov died in a German prisoner of war camp in 1943. His father had refused to save him, and that refusal was somehow perfectly consistent with the man Stalin had become, and perfectly consistent with what that man had done to a 9-month-old boy by walking away from his mother's funeral and never really coming back. Vasily, the son with Nadezhda, was pushed into a military career he wasn't suited for, promoted beyond any merit he possessed, surrounded by people who agreed with him because disagreeing with Stalin's son was dangerous. He became an alcoholic. He died in 1962, 9 years after his father, at the age of 40. Svetlana was Stalin's favorite. He was demonstrably warmer toward her than toward his sons. He called her his little sparrow. And then, as she grew up and made her own choices, particularly about the men she loved, whom Stalin consistently disapproved of, even that warmth curdled. He had one of her early romantic interests arrested. He made clear that she was not a person with autonomous preferences. She was an extension of him. She eventually defected to the West in 1967, 14 years after his death. She changed her name to Alliluyeva, her mother's name, not his. She spent decades trying to understand and describe the man who had been her father, and she never entirely succeeded, because no one has. The psychological portrait is incomplete without this. The monster is not the whole picture. Neither, perhaps, is knowing that it isn't. Stalin read voraciously, 500 pages a day at his peak by some accounts, an almost implausible rate, but consistent enough across sources that historians take it seriously. His personal library eventually contained tens of thousands of books, many of them annotated in his hand. He read history, philosophy, military theory, literature, political economy. He read Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Machiavelli, and a range of historical biographies about strong, centralizing rulers, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great. His engagement with Eisenstein's film about Ivan the Terrible is one of the genuinely strange episodes of his rule. He gave Eisenstein a detailed critique, objecting to the portrayal of Ivan's terror guard as too dark, too pathological. Ivan, Stalin argued, should have been shown as a great national leader. The massacres were necessary. The violence served a purpose. He was arguing for a more favorable portrayal of a 16th century Tsar's use of political terror, from a position of intimate personal expertise. He loved cinema generally. He particularly liked John Ford's westerns and Soviet comedies. He would summon the members of his inner circle, Molotov, Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, to watch movies with him in the small hours of the morning. And they would sit in the dark and laugh at whatever he laughed at, express appropriate enthusiasm, because they had no choice. These gatherings were not social occasions. They were performances of loyalty required by a man who could not simply sit alone and watch a film, who needed the presence of others, partly for company and partly for control. He loved roses. He gardened, actually gardened, with his own hands. His daughter Svetlana remembered flowers as one of the genuinely human things about him. The pleasure he took in them seemed real, unperformed, not connected to his role or his image. He was afraid of many things, though he concealed it carefully. He was afraid of assassination. The security arrangements around him were extraordinary. Multiple dashas, regularly changed residences, food tasters, elaborate protocols around any physical contact. One of his doctors, the neurologist Vladimir Bekhterev, examined him in 1927 and reportedly described him to a colleague as a paranoiac. Bekhterev died within 24 hours of that examination. The son who demanded his father's body be returned for examination was executed. The wife died in a prison camp. The 3 children were sent to separate orphanages. He was afraid of being seen as weak. He was afraid of being ordinary. This may be the deepest fear, the one that organized all the others. The boy from Gori, the cobbler's son with the scarred face and the bad arm, had built the largest country on earth into something that could project power to every corner of the globe. To acknowledge any limitation, any failure, any vulnerability was to risk collapsing back into the provincial nobody who had needed to borrow a fictional hero's name to feel like anyone at all. Here is something that should stop you. The Great Purge was not chaos. It was paperwork. It was a man at a desk, working through names. The Great Purge of 1936 to 1938 was not an accident. It was not a temporary madness that overcame an otherwise rational administration. It was the full expression of a system that had been built, piece by piece, over more than a decade, by a man who understood that absolute power requires the elimination of everyone who remembers when you didn't have it. Stalin's paranoia was probably real in the clinical sense. Multiple assessments by psychologists and psychiatrists examining the available record have concluded as much. But his paranoia was also rational in a specific and troubling way, because the threats he perceived were not entirely imaginary. He had enemies, real ones. What the paranoid architecture of the Purge did was to make the category of enemy so broad, so elastic, so definitionally unstable that it could expand to absorb anyone. An enemy was not simply someone who actively opposed the regime. An enemy was someone who had once known someone who had opposed the regime. Someone who had expressed doubt privately, in a letter intercepted by the secret police. Someone whose foreign background made them theoretically susceptible to foreign influence. Someone whose too rapid promotion made Stalin wonder what they were building. The NKVD conducted the purge on his direct instructions, working from lists that Stalin reviewed personally. He signed death warrants, thousands of them. One batch delivered in a single session reportedly contained several hundred names. A list on a desk, names in rows, a pen moving down the page. He worked through them methodically, sometimes adding names, sometimes marking them for further interrogation, sometimes approving the execution order. He did this the way other men do paperwork. It was the job. It was the logic of the system he had built. Bukharin's case has been studied with particular intensity. He was the most prominent, the most intellectually sophisticated of Stalin's victims. He understood what was happening to him. In a letter he wrote to Stalin shortly before his execution, a letter discovered in the Soviet archives after the USSR's collapse, Bukharin wrote with what can only be described as anguished clarity. He knew he was going to die. He knew the confession was a lie. He asked with a kind of desperate logic that his death not be announced publicly as an execution, that he be allowed to die quietly, that some remnant of his reputation be preserved. Stalin kept the letter. He filed it away. Bukharin was shot. Approximately 1 million people were executed during the Great Purge. The Red Army's officer corps was devastated. 3 of its 5 marshals and most of its top generals shot or imprisoned. A decision that would nearly destroy the Soviet Union when Germany invaded in 1941. By the mid-1930s, his face was everywhere. Schools, factories, train stations, postage stamps. A smooth, authoritative face that bore only a passing resemblance to the pockmarked man behind the curtain. The cult wasn't ego. It was engineering. He was called the father of nations, the Coryphaeus of science, the genius of mankind, the best friend of children. The public address systems that were installed throughout Soviet cities played his speeches. The newspapers printed his words with reverential margins. He almost certainly knew it was theater. The private Stalin, the one who drank with his subordinates, who quietly arranged for photographs to be retouched, was not a man who fully believed his own mythology. He was more sophisticated than that. He had constructed the mythology as a tool, not as a truth. But there is a more complicated layer. Some evidence suggests that while he knew the cult was artificial, he also needed it. Not believed it exactly. Needed it. The gap between Soso-Jughashvili and Stalin, the genius of mankind, was vast and required constant maintenance. The worship of millions had to stand between him and the memory of the boy who had needed to borrow a name from a novel. When you build your identity on the performance of strength and greatness, the performance cannot stop, because stopping means the underlying emptiness becomes visible. He was described by those who survived close contact with him as a master of charm and a master of menace, sometimes exercising both in the same conversation. He could be hilarious. He could make a man feel uniquely valued, singled out, seen, and the same man could be dead within a week. Khrushchev, who knew him for decades and feared him for most of that time, described the experience of attending Stalin's late-night dinners. You were summoned. You came. You ate and drank whatever he put in front of you. You laughed when he laughed. You went home in the early morning knowing that the next summons might not be an invitation. You woke up each day uncertain whether you were still in favor. And this uncertainty, Khrushchev suggests, was not accidental. It was the instrument. Keep everyone uncertain enough, and no coalition ever forms, no block of the discontent ever coheres. Because discontent in isolation is survivable, but discontent in common is fatal to the leader. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Stalin was not unprepared in the specific sense that his intelligence services had been warning him for months. He was unprepared in a different sense. He did not believe it. He did not believe it partly because he had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany in 1939 and genuinely thought it would hold for longer, and partly because he had systematically suppressed and punished those who told him things he didn't want to hear. In the environment of the purge, the intelligence apparatus had learned to be careful about delivering bad news. When the invasion came, it came with a scale and speed that was genuinely shocking. The Wehrmacht drove hundreds of miles into Soviet territory in the first days, destroying entire armies that had been poorly positioned, poorly commanded, in part because so many of their senior officers had been purged. Stalin, by multiple accounts, was shattered. He retreated to his dacha. He may have suffered something close to a breakdown. For several days, the most powerful man in the Soviet Union was unreachable. He came back. That too is documented. Whatever happened in those few days, whatever inner negotiation, whatever reassembly of the persona, he returned to Moscow, went on radio, and addressed the Soviet people in terms of Russian national feeling rather than Marxist ideology. He called them friends, brothers and sisters. He did not speak as the party secretary. He spoke as a Tsar. The Soviet victory over Nazi Germany is the most complex part of Stalin's legacy, and it resists simple summary. The cost was extraordinary, somewhere between 27 million and 30 million Soviet deaths by most estimates, a number so large that it exceeds comprehension. His strategic decisions contributed to those deaths. The purging of the officer corps before the war, the refusal to believe the invasion was coming, the order to hold positions rather than conduct strategic withdrawals in the war's early phases. These decisions cost millions of lives. And yet, the Soviet Union held Stalingrad, Kursk, the siege of Leningrad, the counteroffensives of 1942 and 1943 and 1944. Whatever assessment one makes of the terror and the purges, the Soviet military victory over Nazi Germany is historical fact, and it happened under his leadership. By 1950, Stalin was in his early 70s and not well. His health had been declining since at least 1945, when he may have suffered a mild stroke or heart attack. The records are incomplete, partly because the medical staff around him were in a state of chronic anxiety about what happened to doctors who delivered bad news. He became increasingly isolated, spending more time at his dacha than in the Kremlin. The inner circle, Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, Bulganin, were summoned for dinners and film screenings and kept in a state of suspended anxiety, never knowing if this evening was the last one where they would leave the table with their freedom intact. He was still working, still signing documents, still reaching into the machinery of the Soviet state with the same obsessive attention to personnel and policy that had characterized him since the beginning. But the judgments were becoming more erratic, the suspicions more extreme. In January 1953 came the doctor's plot. 13 physicians, 9 of them Jewish, were accused of a vast conspiracy to murder Soviet leaders through deliberate medical malpractice. The announcement was made in Pravda, and it set off a wave of anti-Semitic terror across the country. Dismissals, arrests, mob violence, the full apparatus of state-manufactured fear directed at Jewish citizens. Most historians who have studied the doctor's plot are confident that it was the opening move in what would have been a major new wave of terror, comparable to the purge of the 1930s, possibly exceeding it. The 4 large camps built in Siberia in the months before Stalin's death, the lists being compiled, the trajectory of the accusations. It all pointed toward a catastrophe that was ready to unfold. Stalin himself told the NKVD chief to get full confessions from the doctors, saying that if he didn't, he would reduce his height by a head. The language of execution as a casual threat, delivered in the course of an administrative discussion. This was by 1953 simply how he spoke. In the end, the man who had made millions of others wait for verdicts, for executions, for permission to live, spent 13 hours waiting for someone to help him. On the night of February 28, 1953, Stalin watched a film with Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin, as he often did. The evening ended around 5 or 6 in the morning. He was reportedly in good spirits, joking, prodding Khrushchev in the stomach and calling him by his Ukrainian nickname as a sign of affection. They left. He went to bed. He did not emerge the following day, which was unusual. His security staff, trained to never disturb him, waited. By late afternoon, they were sufficiently alarmed that one of them cracked open the door of his room. He was lying on the floor, conscious but unable to move or speak coherently. He had suffered a massive stroke. What happened next has been the subject of intense historical debate ever since. The members of his inner circle were called. Beria and Malenkov arrived first, looked at the man on the floor, and left. They did not call doctors. Not immediately. Not for hours. Whether this delay was the result of fear, or whether it was something more calculated, something closer to a decision, we cannot say with certainty. In an environment where showing too much initiative could cost you your life, even medical emergency produced paralysis. 13 hours passed before medical help arrived. 13 hours on the floor, while the most powerful men in the Soviet Union made careful decisions about when to decide. Stalin died on March 5, 1953 at 9:50 in the evening. He was 74 years old. His daughter Svetlana, who was present in the final hours, described his face changing color, his features becoming unrecognizable. And then, in the last moment, he opened his eyes and raised one hand, as if pointing at someone or something in the room, or at everyone in the room. His hand fell. At some point during those final hours, Beria reportedly turned to his colleagues and said, "I did him in. I saved all of you." The grief that followed Stalin's death was real. This is one of the most unsettling facts about him. Hundreds of thousands of people came to Moscow to view his body, and the crowds were so dense that dozens were trampled to death in the streets. The final mass casualty event of his rule, caused not by his orders, but by the weight of feeling his death produced. Many of those people genuinely mourned him, not because they were coerced, though grief was certainly the safest emotion to display, but because the cult of personality had done its work so thoroughly across 3 decades that his image had become inseparable from the Soviet experience itself. Khrushchev's secret speech of 1956, delivered to a closed session of the 20th Party Congress, then leaked, then circulated throughout the world, was the first serious official reckoning with what Stalin had been. Khrushchev described the cult of personality, described the purges, described the torture of loyal communists. His audience reportedly wept. Some fainted. One delegate died of a heart attack during the session. The Gulag, the network of labor camps that stretched across the Soviet Union, was a world unto itself. At its peak in the early 1950s, it held somewhere between 1 and 2 million prisoners at any given time. The total number of people who passed through it over the decades running into the tens of millions. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who survived the Gulag and spent years documenting it, described it as a world with its own language, its own social hierarchies, its own moral logic. A world that Stalin had created and maintained not as an aberration, but as a functional component of the Soviet economic and political system. The White Sea Canal, completed in 1933 and celebrated with great Soviet fanfare, was built largely by Gulag labor, at a cost of somewhere between 10 and 25,000 lives, possibly more. Stalin visited the completed canal. He approved a commemorative book about the heroic construction project. The book mentioned nothing about the deaths. Those are not statistics in the way that statistics normally function. They are people. Each one was a person with a name and a history, and people who knew them and felt their absence. There is a question at the center of every serious psychological study of Stalin, and it doesn't resolve. It's this: was this man a monster who happened to present a human surface? Or was he a human being in whom something monstrous grew? The evidence points toward the second answer, but the second answer is more disturbing than the first. A pure monster is comforting in a way. It places the horror safely outside the range of ordinary human experience. But a human being in whom something monstrous grew, beginning in a small town in Georgia with a drunk father and a scarred face and a borrowed name. That story is about something that happens inside the range of ordinary experience, something that begins with recognizable pain and ordinary humiliation and moves through a series of choices and the weight of power toward catastrophe. He loved roses. He was afraid of his own death. He sang beautifully. He read 500 pages a day. He wept at his first wife's grave and said she took with her his last warm feelings for humanity. He was capable of genuine warmth in brief flashes, genuine aesthetic feeling. And he signed death warrants for hundreds of people in an evening as a matter of administrative routine. The proximity of those things, not the alternation between them, but their coexistence, is what makes him such a demanding subject. Easy portraits of him flatten something real. The pure monster is wrong. The complex human being is also insufficient, because it risks becoming an explanation that slides toward excuse. What is certain is that the childhood experiences of violence and humiliation, the physical damage and the shame it carried, the early construction of an alter ego to survive that damage, the years underground in an environment of total distrust, the accumulation of power in a system that rewarded ruthlessness and punished doubt. All of these things combined to produce someone who had nearly completely severed the ordinary human mechanism that makes killing other people feel wrong. And that severance had consequences that dwarfed in scale anything the boy from Gori could have imagined. When he read a novel about an avenger and said, "That is who I am." History is full of figures who made themselves, who took the material of a difficult life and shaped it into something that changed the world. The shaping can go toward goodness or away from it. And the same qualities, intelligence, will, patience, the capacity to read people, the refusal to be small, can serve either direction. Stalin used them in the direction he chose. This is not an exoneration. We can trace how something came to be without concluding that it was inevitable or justified or acceptable. The boy named So-So grew up and became Coba, and then became Stalin, and then became the father of nations. And then, on a floor in a dacha outside Moscow, became simply an old man in the dark, unable to speak, pointing at something no one else could see. And the people he had gathered around him, the men who had survived all the dinners and all the film screenings and all the late-night conversations in which the wrong word could mean death, stood around him and waited, and were careful, and did not hurry. There is something in that image, in that long, silent, careful wait around a dying man, that tells you almost everything about what he had built and what it had cost. What is built in fear tends, in the end, to produce more fear, until there is nothing left in the room but the fear itself. People are not born monsters. They are made by the circumstances they're dropped into before they have any say in the matter, and then by the choices they make, one after another, each one narrowing the available futures, until the person they've become and the person they started out as are almost impossible to reconcile. The boy who sang in the choir, the young man who wrote love poems to a country, the father who called his daughter his sparrow, and the man who signed those lists. Sleep well, and tomorrow, perhaps notice one small thing you did today from a place of genuine care rather than fear. Those things matter too. They also ripple outward. If these calm explorations of history and the human mind are something you find meaningful, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps others find their way here. Good night.